Well, I'm glad to be here. If you read tonight's paper, I'm a little worried. I look out and see Elaine and wonder if I closed the garage door. She talks about memories in the paper tonight that just hit me right square between the eyes. But I do want to talk about Christians on the Oregon Trail, and I need to take some time to explain that because actually most of the people on the Oregon Trail are Christians, but the people we're talking about are a special group who belong to the Disciples of Christ denomination. And the reason it's kind of interesting to talk about is when I first started working on the history of Yamhill County, I worried about, or tried to find out where the first schools were. And I talked to Bruce Stoller quite a bit about that. And I decided the first school was the Scrub Oak School, started by Dr. James McBride up by Carlton. And she said she really thought that the first school was on the Joel Hembry place over by Lafayette. And I dug out a master's thesis by Don Klein, who was one of our high school teachers. And Don Klein said that the first school was started by some Campbellites up by Carlton. But that's all he said. He didn't know any more than that. And so I tried to figure out who these Campbellites were. And at first I thought they were Presbyterians, but I talked to my Presbyterian friends and I said, no, that wasn't them. But they weren't able to tell me who they were. And actually, I did have a hunch, but I really didn't get turned on to who they really were until a couple of 3 years ago. The telephone rang, and Dr. Jerry Rushford from Pepperdine University called, and he says, I'm doing a book, and this is his book. It's called Christians on the Oregon Trail. And he says, the college has asked me to do a history of the Christians in California. And he meant Christian churches, is what he meant. And I said, well, I didn't know much about that. And he said, well, I know. But he said, the more research I do, the more I find out that it was the Oregon Christians who came down and started our church. So I've got to come to Oregon and research the Oregon Trail and research the people who came over that trail to find out who they are and what they were doing up there. Well, we were able to visit several times together and compare notes. And while we really think that the book we did was pretty factual, Dr. Rushford really re-educated us in terms of what many of those people were thinking and their dreams and their hopes for Oregon were. So in order to get into that, I need to do some background on what he called the Restoration Movement and return to the biblical pattern of the New Testament church in doctrine, worship, and practice. And this was a basic goal that these people had. They one religion for everybody. Now, in the frontier states, there were two main streams of the movement. The one in Kentucky, where Barton Stone led the Presbyterian Church, and John Mulkey, the Baptist Association. They both took many preachers and congregations with them in their move. The new church was to be called Christian. By 1811, these two leaders had joined and held sway over many churches in Kentucky, Iowa, and Indiana, also in Tennessee and part of Alabama. Among the preachers making the Baptist move was a Baptist minister named Thomas McBride, whose family we'll spend more time on a little later. Another movement was the Campbell movement, led by Thomas and Alexander Campbell of Bethany, Virginia. The two groups, the Stone Mulkey and the Campbell groups, united in January of 1832 and had more than 25,000 members. They were at some odds about the name, with the Stone Mulkey group insisting that they be called Christian, and the Campbell group preferring Disciples of Christ. Usually the churches became Church of Christ in both groups. Alexander Campbell was to become the dominant figure in the movement, and the greater organization was usually called the Disciples of Christ. Members were to be referred to as Christians. However, with the popular Campbell as spokesman and the acknowledged leader of the group, it was easy for the public to call these people Campbellites. The name Campbellite was disturbing to the Christians, as they felt they were serving their Lord, not a man. Alexander Campbell responded to this slur by calling it a most reproachful epitaph. And later he wrote, "It is a nickname of reproach, invented and adopted by those whose views, feelings, and desires are all sectarian, who cannot conceive of Christianity in any other light than an ism." Well, regardless of the Christians' feelings, the historians did adopt the name Campbellite for those people. Bancroft published his monumental 2 volumes of work and included a very informative section on churches. And he reported that among the other religious denominations of Oregon were the Campbellites. Joseph Gaston published a 4-volume series entitled The Centennial History of Oregon. And it was praised for its thorough research and objective writing. It did not help that the author opened with a disclaimer that no member of the Christian or Disciple of Christ Church need take umbrage at being called a Campbellite. Our own Don Klein, a retired, well-regarded high school teacher, reported in his master's thesis that the first school in Yamhill County seemed to be the one started by the Campbellites. There were exceptions to the trend. Dr. Perkins, the article in the Lynn County paper said that Dr. Perkins preached for the Christians and Reverend H.H. Baldwin for the Presbyterians. In 1921, John Horner wrote, "Bethel College near McCoy, Oregon, was built by the Christians." And Stein Jonason, our own Stein from Linfield College, in his book Bricks Without Straw, said that Linfield College was first begun by the Christians. And Dr. James McBride, a hero of mine, who was one of the Christians who established the school in McMinnville, would have appreciated this acknowledgement. He spoke for the entire movement when he pleaded, "We only ask to be known and called by the name which we have chosen, and that is Christian." And of course, that's the reason that Jerry Rushford from Pepperdine wrote this book. He wanted to establish that it was Christians on the Oregon Trail, not Campbellites. He's done a great deal of research too. And while the name is important to him, the important thing is those people and what they did. Well, that's enough about names. We need to discuss the motives for that torturous trip. We know that life wasn't easy for the farmers in those frontier states, especially in the slave states. Without slaves and a lot of land, it's almost impossible to make a living. Absolutely impossible to compete. As word spread that Congress was considering some kind of a land giveaway, interest in Oregon spread. And it's interesting to note that as early as 1838, the thought of establishing Christian colleges, Disciples of Christ, in Oregon was discussed by the Christian Tyrus Himes in Pennsylvania. He'd read Samuel Parker's book, Journal of the Exploring Tour Beyond the Rocky Mountains, under the direction of the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions in the year 35, 36, and 37. His idea was to take the Christian beliefs to this new land and to establish churches, schools, and universities. He suggested that several families agree to go to Oregon, take up donation claims in a body, and set aside a portion of the same as a nucleus fund for a fund which to endow a Christian college. First Christian to make the trip across the trail, that you can document, was Reuben Lewis in 1842. That wagon train was a small train and did They didn't bring the wagons all the way. They left the wagons at Fort Hall. But in the year 1843, a large number of Christians gathered together and decided they wanted to make the trip to Oregon. One of the outstanding people who was a converted Christian in 1843 was Peter Burnett. And he was the kind of catalyst to initiate that trip. Actually, he was in debt. He had debts of $15,000 and a wife seriously ill with consumption. Burnett was trying to eke out a living by running a small store in western Missouri. The prospect of free land in Oregon was almost too much to be true. Since he had a wife and 6 children, he would be entitled to 1,600 acres. Consulting his creditors, he received their permission to seek his fortune in the land of Eden. Burnett was born in Nashville, Tennessee in 1807, and it was not until his early 30s that he became aware of the Christian movement and became a Christian. He was a powerful speaker for the Lord and for Oregon. He understood the motives of the Christians in wanting to go to Oregon and touched many families with his message. He was more successful than anyone dreamed he could be. On that first wagon train, we find a host of Christians traveling to the Promised Land. William and Sarah McGarry Newton, both in their early 20s. They had just been married by Dr. James McBride and converted to the Christian church. They were from McMinnville, Tennessee, and anxious to be on their way. They were accompanied by a good friend and fellow Christian, Chelsea B. Gray. The Hembry family were also traveling in this train and were good friends of the Newbies and also from McMinnville, Tennessee. There was Joel Jordan and Sally Payne Hembry and their 8 children, Andrew and Martha Hembry, and Absalom J. and Nancy Dodson Hembry and their 4 small children. There also was Peter and Harriet Burnett and 6 children, Alexander and the line of Blevins, Catherine Blevins Baker, John Baker's wife. Jerry Rushman said John Baker wasn't a Christian, so he didn't include his name. William and Millie Arthur, whose daughter Mahala would marry Samuel Kozine, and Daniel Matheny's sons, who became strong Christians in a few short years. That wagon train was loaded with Campbellites, or Christians, as Jerry wants us to call them. And of course, there were Baptists, there were Methodists, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, and even a few non-believers on that train. They were basically white Protestant believers who had the ability to read the Bible, write to some extent. It is no wonder that the Oregon Trail people like to tell of the sign at the forks of the trail near Fort Hall. There, one point south has a picture of Goldore on it. The other points west and says to Oregon. Those who could read went to Oregon. Most people who talk about the Oregon Trail like to stress that point. Of course, that wasn't true, but the people who came to Oregon were able to read. They had schools and churches in mind. They had farming and settling the country. They were not out for quick riches in the gold mines, although it's amazing how many of them went south to mine gold after they got here. But it's true. Those people, those thinkers and readers were able to come to Oregon and have established a tradition that I think we still are following today. Well, not many church meetings were held during those first years. All of those Christian men were preachers. They all could preach. They all did. It was true of most of the Methodist men, too. And they took turns meeting in each other's house and preaching. James McBride, who had settled, he brought 10 youngsters across that trail, had 5 more when he was here. Settled, his property was just diagonal from the Carlton meat plant. And that's where he started his school, the Shrub Oak School. He started that school in 18 47. He came in 46, he built his log cabin, put a lean-to on it. He hired, well, this is getting ahead here. By the fall of 1846, James McBride and his 10 children arrived. With him were his father, Thomas McBride, who we mentioned earlier, an outstanding Christian preacher. And Glenn Burnett came with that train, and his family, all strong Christian preachers. Glenn Burnett was a brother of Peter Burnett. And also William Lysander Adams, Sebastian Adams' brother, arrived with that wagon train. Sebastian didn't come until a few years later. And then things began to hop for the Christians. James McBride had brought 141 books on his train, on his wagon, and they threw away a lot of furniture and a lot of things. They didn't throw any books away, so that his children would be well educated. One of his first chores after building shelter for the family was to start a school. And this was in a lean-to next to his house. He taught for a while, but was able to hire William Adams as a teacher. And here is what Mrs. Inez Eugenia Adams Parker has to say in her unpublished early recollections of Oregon pioneer life. Her father, William Lysander Adams, and later her uncle, Sebastian Adams. And you know Sebastian? He's our Adams Street, Adams School. Sebastian's the one that planted our town. Sebastian Adams were teachers at McBride School, which was then called Scrub Oak School. Actually, William Adams hung a sign on the door naming it Yamhill University. And it wasn't a bad name, because listen to this results. Out of the school came a governor of Oregon and the territory of Utah, George Woods, and a representative to Congress, John McBride, the Supreme Court Justice of Oregon, Thomas McBride, Dr. James McBride, a millionaire physician in Pasadena, another George W. McBride, 2 brothers, Dr. Thomas Shelton of Eugene, Oregon, and Dr. James Shelton of Salem, Oregon, and Dr. L.L. Rowland, State Superintendent of Schools. A pretty good showing of a school with 22 pupils. Dr. McBride, and Dr. McBride was a medical doctor. He had been a surgeon in the Army during the Osage Wars and Osage Indian Wars. And so he took care of a lot of medical needs while he was here. He took care of the schools. He was a man who had a bright future ahead of him and had lots of ideas. Well, one day, Dr. McBride, the Adams brothers, and Ben Bennett were about the Lord's business of converting people to their way of thinking. But there was resentment, and the Christians felt discriminated against by the other religions. The Methodists and the Presbyterians were very hard on them because of the belief in total immersion. They were accused of being proselyters, and they were. And many congregations feared of losing their members, and they did. The Baptists tolerated them because they believed in immersion. By 1850, fully 10% of the non-Indian population in Oregon were members of the Christian faith, Christians who had come across the Oregon Trail. And that was no small number. In 1850, that was almost 1,200 people. In the early 50s, it was in the early 50s that the Christians began to remember about the need for colleges. The early plans to group Christians together and donate land was being put into force. In McMinnville, 4 Christians met and decided it was time to build a college. They were William Newby, William Dawson, Sebastian Adams, and Dr. James McBride. Newby would donate the land, and the 4 of them would put up the money or collateral to build the building. They hired Wilson Carl to build the new hall, which was L-shaped, 2 stories high, and 70 feet on each L. Tom Michael likes to tell me that when it was used as a college, the top floor was a dormitory with the boys at one end and the girls at the other. The second floor ceiling was cheese cloth. And the boys kept falling through when they would check out the girls. Sounds possible. Yeah, first co-ed dorm, I guess. Anyway, Sebastian became the teacher, professor, president, etc. for the next year. However, the four men felt that the cost of keeping this school going was too expensive. They already had invested a lot in building the building, and so they gave it to the Baptist Association in Oregon City. And the Baptists took over the next year. In the area where Monmouth now stands, we find a dozen Christians taking land donation claims and following exactly the plan put forth by church elders several years before. They settled next to each other, donated land to the to-be town, named it Monmouth, and erected a college to be called Monmouth Christian College. They donated over 400 acres for town lots, sold the lots, and the school was well endowed. As in McMinnville, they were unable to keep up with the cost of the school, and it was donated to the state and would become Monmouth Normal School, now Western Oregon State University. In addition to these two schools, Glenn Burnett, and I should mention Peter Burnett here. When Peter got to Oregon, he found he ran across the manuscript of the great debate between the Catholic and the Protestant ministers that took place in 1835, I think it was, and I can't remember their names. But Peter read that, and he said, I need to stop and think about what my religion really is. And so he took 18 months off from the church. And when he came back to the Catholic Church. And that was a really blow to the Christians, because he was an outstanding preacher and they would miss him. But Peter Burnett then went on to California and became the first governor of California. But his brother Glenn Burnett was probably the outstanding preacher for the Christian church here in Oregon. And he lived down in McCoy, near McCoy, and he was busy starting a college at Bethel, the same way as they had at Monmouth. In 1855, the Bethel College was chartered by the legislature as Bethel Institute and was opened with great prospects and about 60 pupils. L.L. Rowland and N. Hudson, familiar names in the history of McMinnville or Yamhill and Polk counties, were the first teachers. At the very early day, the school was well-selected library and apparatus for teaching in the Department of Science. Bethel had some rivals in the same county. The school in Monmouth made 3 schools very close to each other, and Bethel was not able to compete. Levi Lindsay Rowland, the son of L.L. Rowland, returned to Oregon in 1859 after graduating from Campbell's Bethel College in Virginia, and was made president of Bethel College. I think the school lasted another 5 or 6 years and finally folded from the competition in Monmouth. Now, in the meantime, the Christians were getting into politics. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? Dr. McBride and William Adams had an opportunity to hear E.C. Baker campaign for Abe Lincoln. They were very impressed. By the time Adams had gone on to Oregon City, as editor of the Argus, and was wielding a powerful hand as a writer. He and Dr. McBride decided it was time to form a party that would support Lincoln. They were the founding fathers of the Oregon Republican Party. That may be good or bad, depending upon which side you stand. Because of their work, Lincoln would appoint them to favorite positions. Adams went to Astoria as a port commissioner, and Dr. McBride was appointed emissary to the Sandwich Islands and was headquartered in Honolulu. Here, Secretary of State Seward gave him credit for holding the English fleet stationed there at bay. Lincoln, being afraid that the English were looking for a way to join the Confederates, and afraid that they may attack the West Coast. And he gave him credit for developing a trust with the Hawaiians that wasn't there, and then for discovering through his friendship with the admiral of the Russian fleet that the Alaska was for sale. The Tsar wanted to unload the place. McBride was able to assess the value of the timber, fisheries, furs, and strategic value of Alaska and forward it to Seward. Seward gives credit to McBride for his work and said that as soon as the war was settled, they would consider a purchase. Seward's folly is well known, but he had McBride's report and realized they had a good deal. Historians do give McBride credit for authoring the purchase. And so these Christians who were members of the Church of Christ were a powerful influence on the settlement and development of Oregon. There are others, heroes, and there are many groups that made an impact, both Christian and non-Christian. But the power and strength of the Christians to spread the word and educate the people has to be admired. One goal the Christians never met was to bring all churches under one doctrine. Dr. Rushford was in McMinnville at the Christian church about 2 years ago and spoke to a full house about Christians on the Oregon Trail. At that meeting, he found 11 different branches of the Church of Christ represented. So, and he said that wasn't all. He said there's a lot more. And that is the story of the Christians on the Oregon Trail. I have found it very interesting that these people had more than their own self at stake when they made the trip, that they were considering the education, the Christianization, and the socialization of the total people here on the West Coast. They weren't entirely successful, but just having started those 3 colleges has to be admired. They were able to go into California and perform some of the same. And they did it basically by claiming land and donating some of it back to make a city, sell the lots, and build a college. And those colleges, like Bethel College, it's interesting to note that Bethel College, under Rowland, specialized in the sciences. And conservative churches nowadays really don't like that to happen. But it was important to them that everybody had as much knowledge as possible. And so, I'll stop there. If you have any questions or corrections, I'd be glad to listen. All right.
I want to thank Jim. He talks about like the people he knows, and I think that's what makes it nice to listen to him. We appreciate having him part of our society and our friends.